Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the show. Today we're going to talk about the oldest seagoing vessel ever discovered in archaeology. There have been other boats, like river boats and stuff like that, as discovered like 38,000, 40,000 years ago, but they were not necessarily seagoing vessels. And if you know anything about maritime building or marine archaeology or anything about boats, seagoing vessels are a completely different beast when we're talking about ships. And the ones that the Egyptians had were unlike any of the other seagoing vessels that we've seen in history, and especially in the ancient world. And I'll go into that, the reasons for that as we go along. Another interesting part of this article, which by the way comes from Discover magazine, this kind of closes the door on the mystery of where the ancient land of Punt, P-U-N-T, was. And for the longest time, a lot of archaeologists and historians have debated what this mysterious land was. And if you don't know what Punt is, it's mentioned in as early as the 1800s BC, I believe, maybe even older. Some of the writings of the Egyptian kingdom at the time, they spoke of trading with the people of that kingdom, and they also mentioned that they were a tributary state or a tributary country. Whatever it was, they swore fealty to the pharaoh. As such, they collected tax or mainly incense from the people of Punt, and it was, like I mentioned earlier, it was debated for a long time where it was. It boiled down to two places: either Libya, or according to biblical scholars who thought it was the ancient land of Put, P-U-T, I think that's what Put. And then the other more compelling reason, or location rather, was somewhere off the coast of modern-day Ethiopia. Now that this discovery closes the case on that, and that it is probably 99% sure, you always got to leave that small window just in case something, little margin of error. But more than likely, this is smoking gun evidence that Put had to have been a place where you had to get to by boat, because Libya, there's no way to get there on boat from Egypt without going to through the Mediterranean Sea. But that's not what the inscriptions were saying in any case. So Libya could not be the reference that a lot of biblical scholars were insisting it was. So anyway, so this is the relief that's in question here, which is at the temple of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut in Luxor. So it shows a merchant ship, this giant ship, by the way, that looks like a fruit bowl, and it's on a trading expedition, which is later on going to be recreated by the archaeologists mentioned in this article here. At the time, just some background information: Hatshepsut. Yeah, I was right the first time. She was a female pharaoh ruling over 2 million plus people. So that right away, this is to get to the point of 2 million person population in a kingdom. That's pretty high level, and in order to get to that spot, a lot of infrastructure has to be in place. A culture has to be firmly established. It has to be a very stable atmosphere, socially, culturally, politically, all that stuff, economically. So that should let you know, kind of like how a person who's really fat, it takes a lot of calories to keep that up, and certain habits and certain lifestyle choices. And if you're someone who doesn't think too deeply about that stuff, you would just say, oh, that's just an overweight person. When if you pull back the curtain, you wanted to see how they get there, and if you go into the details, it's just, you can see that they probably there's a lot of calories going in. The same thing with if you look at it from a perspective of a country. Wow, this country is bustling with people. There's probably a lot of immigrants or people passing through, no doubt, but it's a metropolitan area in the ancient world. So I just want to get that out of the way and keep that in mind when we're talking about seagoing vessels, because with seagoing vessels, it's the same thing. There's like an iceberg thing. You just see the surface. Yeah, okay, so what? They had seagoing vessels. But think about all the innovation and all the knowledge that had to be put into getting to that level. And they didn't invent seagoing vessels. The Egyptians definitely, even though they are the possessors of the oldest seagoing vessel ever found up to date, they most likely did not invent that seagoing vessel. It's too complicated. The techniques are too polished and too well thought out for it to have been, like, say, the Wright brothers airplane or something like that. It wasn't some contraption, or it would have been a contraption-like thing if they did invent it, and you would see a lot of trial and error. But in this case, they have these skills. They have shipbuilding skills, and a new new lens rather, should be looked through, a maritime lens looked through when examining the ancient Egypt, especially at this time and earlier. This is only between 1800 to 1400 BC, so it's not even that old. It should be considered, I think, that if they did indeed use seagoing vessels, then they should be looked at more of a maritime civilization. The more interesting thing here is that the Egyptians talk about Zep-Tepi. I don't know if you guys know about that. I'm pretty sure some of you hardcore people know about Zep-Tepi, which is roughly translated to the first time, which can only be assumed that it was their reference to where Egyptian civilization started. And they call the Atlantean story, where there was an already fully formed, beautiful utopian, maybe not even utopian, but it was just an advanced civilization that fell apart, and some of the people came over to the land of Kem, which is the ancient word for what we know as Egypt, or that land. It shouldn't be a coincidence that if Atlantis did indeed exist, they were described as a maritime civilization. So if there were stragglers from Atlantis that came to Egypt, it makes sense that they brought those skills, those civilizing skills with them, up to and including agriculture, city planning and building, irrigation, and shipbuilding. So all this makes a lot of sense when you look at it from, I guess, a more broader view. So anyway, let's get into the nitty-gritty. People have argued that Punt was inland, not on the sea, or they thought it was fictitious altogether. This has settled the debate. And the excavation site centers around this place called Mersa Gawasis, which basically means a boat port, or a port for boats. And this is a dried up lagoon. So in its heyday, it was an ideal harbor because there wasn't a lot of high tide. It was an ideal place to set sail from as a base of operations, and to launch voyages and stuff like that. And just to give you guys a reference, this is where it's located. This is the satellite image of the Red Sea. So you can see here that it's on the western shore, or the bank rather, of the Red Sea. And here's another look at this map. And although this is a map that's way later than the time we're talking about, it's still the same. So this is Aponi here, which is allegedly to have been, or heavily rumored to be, this place called Punt. And if you look at where the Red Sea is, then it makes sense that they would need a seagoing vessel to go down and out of this strait here. I forgot the name of the strait, but it's a strait, and to go around the Horn of Africa and into what's now, I think this is the Indian Ocean. Yeah, the Indian Ocean, and to go down and make this almost a 90-degree turn, almost further than that, 45-degree turn, and to make it to where the Egyptians were wanting to go. Now, a lot of people would say, oh, why didn't they just take the land route? You can easily get there by land. Why would they even need the seagoing vessel? Well, that's what they were doing. Obviously, they would take the land route if it was accessible to them. But at the time of the 1400s BC, when Hatshepsut was running things, there was a country here that was hostile, and it was no longer accessible to get into where the land of Punt was, which, by the way, is surrounded by these mountains here. You can literally see there's only one way in here. You got to go in this valley here between these two mountain ranges to get there. So it does make sense that their only other way to get through was to use their maritime skills and sail there. So a lot of this makes sense if you just assume that this find is legit. So they found this cave about 70 feet deep, and they found a bunch of stuff. They found rope, giant wood planks. They found old repurposed anchors. Even some of the old doors there were made out of old planks from the ship. And these aren't scrap pieces of the ship. These are actual pieces that required no metal hinges or anything to bind the wood together. Rather, they were cut like jigsaw pieces that interlocked together so they could be easily assembled and disassembled. So they would take these huge voyages down into Aksum or wherever it was in modern day Ethiopia, or this land of Punt, or wherever it is that they needed to go through the ocean. They would load it all up with crew members, as well as all of these supplies and what they're trading, and then they would land where they were going, and then disassemble their boat, and then do their trading, and then they would either go back to Egypt on foot, or they would reassemble it and go back through the ocean. So this is really, really advanced stuff. You'd be really hard pressed to do this with modern day technology. And by the way, that's what they did here. These archaeologists did recreate to the best of their ability this boat, and we'll get into that in a second. So they found that the rope was woven from papyrus, which is a huge clue that was from the Nile Valley. They uncovered 6 other caves at this site. So this must have been a regularly used site, because not only because of the remains of these old seagoing ships, not only because of these inscriptions that they found these planks of wood that had inscriptions talking about going to Punt and talking about these trade expeditions. But not only that, when you go inside the caves, they were structured in a way, architecturally speaking, the same way an Egyptian barracks would be drawn up on a blueprint or whatever. So the layout is very similar. So that's another hint that this was being used regularly by the Egyptians, pretty much. So the team here, Addis Ababa, and then Rodolfo Fadovich, they were doing this for a long time. They were following sort of as a hobby, as a side project rather. Since the 70s they came in and they were looking around, and they were obsessed with this idea of finding the lost city of Punt. And now, after so many years, they've finally, after following this lead in the 70s, they found some scattered rock mounds. They went and looked, and then they looked again. They didn't find much, and then they looked again, and then they finally found a cave 16 by 6 feet. And then they found another place even larger, like 70 feet, 15 by 70 feet. And they found shattered storage jars, broken boxes, cedar planks, grinding stones, pottery inscribed with the name of Amenemhet the third, which goes back to 1800 BC. So that's the archaeological evidence that helps them give them the date. But it could be even older. The article doesn't mention anything about radiocarbon dating, so that would be interesting to get some actual dates. But at the very least, 1800 BC, 3,800 years ago, give or take, this cave was in use. So even outside the caves, they found more evidence. They found crumbled stone, conch shells, Evidence of altars the seafarers built before, they would pray and before the voyage and stuff like that. They found steering oars, and then inscriptions that specifically mention Punt, like I mentioned earlier. Fragments of ebony and pottery that would have come from southern Red Sea 1,000 miles away. So again, if they're at a port here at the northwestern bank of the Red Sea, and 1,000 is that what they said? 1,000 miles? Yeah, 1,000 miles away, it would make a lot of sense that they were going back and forth and bringing goods back. So yeah, it's pretty an open shut case here. About the ship, the original ship would have been almost 100 feet long based on the planks. It was essentially one giant hull. The craft required much larger timbers for strength. They needed 60 tons. So Ward, he's this guy who's in charge of recreating the ship. He needed 60 tons of Douglas fir as a stand-in for the Lebanese cedar used by the ancient Egyptians. I guess they couldn't get 60 tons of Lebanese cedar. But that's a lot of weight. Okay, 60 tons of anything's insane. So, like I mentioned earlier, they don't need metal fasteners. They just carved with curves that nested into adjacent parts like puzzle pieces. And they sailed their 66-foot reconstruction. So it's a lot smaller than the original. So 66 feet. So the original must have been 100. So probably needed well over 60 tons of wood to get going. And it looked like a giant wooden salad bowl. There's no... I can't find a picture of it, but let me see. Well, anyway... The ship proved to be agile and fast. It weathered 10-foot waves and winds over 20 knots. Had 2 massive steering oars to keep the ship from keeping balance and stay on course. The ship hit 10 miles an hour with most of its sails furled up. So that's 3 times faster than the average modern sailboat. So these Egyptians knew what they were doing. And this is only with stone, copper tools, and wood. That's it. So what knowledge base were they tapped into to be so confident to not only build these at an industrial level? I mean, they knew exactly what they needed, and they had it built within like a month or so. And then not only that, they have this huge tradition. They know exactly where they need to go. So they must have been, again, it makes you think of archives and Library of Alexandria and all these things. Who knows what was burned in that fire, because they might have been tapped into some literature, some shipbuilding genius whose name is lost in the annals of time, who maybe had a book about just shipbuilding. Maybe there was an Einstein back then. In fact, I would probably have to bet that there probably was someone who either pioneered or popularized this idea, because it seemed to work for a lot of kingdoms who we can talk about today, whose name survived to this day, a lot because they had shipbuilding skills. So there was a caravan from Punt and to the Upper Nile, or through the desert, cutting through Sudan, and then there was a hostile country that blocked them geopolitically. There was no way to get through. And not only that, I was talking about earlier, tremendous logistical challenge to plan and carry out these expeditions. So they knew what they were doing for sure. So anyway, that about wraps it up for this video. Let me just try to get a picture. Oh yeah, so here we go. I found it. So this is the reconstructed boat here. So here's the picture here. And this is a lot smaller than what it would have been. This is 66 feet. It would have been 100 feet at the very least. So just to give you an idea, that's a pretty big boat for an ancient civilization. And so here's the 2 oars back here that just stabilized it. And this was almost as near a flawless design as you could get for back then. And even today, a modern boat of this size, it doesn't handle. It might handle better, but it's not as fast. it's actually 3 times slower than this one. So this is really what we're looking at here, guys, is flawless for its time anyway in the ancient world engineering here. So they must have gotten this idea somewhere, and if you believe in Atlantis, or you are in the know about it, then you would understand that it makes sense that they would have these skills. You don't become remembered as a kingdom 4,000 years later unless you've done some incredible things, and this is just one of them. And I don't believe that they constructed the pyramids. I think the date of the 2300 BC or whatever date is, I don't think that they built it then. I think they just had it there. It happened to be there when they became an up and coming power. I think it's a lot older, and the reason why I think that is because there's no inscriptions. There's really nothing that would indicate that it was Egyptian. It wasn't a tomb. It wasn't created expressly to be a tomb. There's the king's chamber, and then there's the queen's chamber, and there's a cavity within the pyramid itself that the Egyptians themselves probably didn't even know about. So I don't know. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Let me know what you guys think of this video. Please leave some comments, like and share, please. That always helps. And I'll see you guys later.